The wreckage drifted in the void, silent and forsaken, the last embers of battle flickering against the backdrop of a dying star. Sanaa moved through the wreckage with practiced ease, her slender form wrapped in the flowing azure robes of her people. She was the last of the Mirath, the last true healer of the forgotten race that once roamed the stars, and in the cold emptiness of space, she could still hear their whispers. Her fingers brushed against twisted metal and charred bodies as she navigated through the ruined warships. The battle had been fierce, a clash between the Zilker Dominion and the Terran Union. Both sides had suffered, but Sanaa had no allegiances. She was not here to choose a side. She was here because the universe demanded it of her. And then she felt it. A pulse of life, faint but stubborn, radiating through the void like a candle fighting the wind. Sanaa followed the sensation, moving through the drifting debris until she found him. A human. His body was suspended in the shattered remains of a cockpit, blood floating in beads around him, his breath shallow within the cracked visor of his helmet. He was dying. She hesitated, as she always did. Every healing took something from her. A part of her energy, a fragment of her soul. She was already weak from her last endeavor, but the Mirath had been clear in their teachings. A healer does not choose. A healer serves. Without another thought, Sanaa reached out, placing her hand against his chest. She closed her eyes, and the transfer began. Pain. It always began with pain. His injuries became hers, his wounds unraveling as her cells burned to compensate. Her breath hitched as broken bones mended, torn muscles stitched themselves back together, and oxygen surged back into his lungs. She pulled away with a gasp, her vision swimming. The strain was immense. It was getting worse each time. Her body was failing, but the universe did not care for her suffering. The human stirred. His eyelids fluttered open, revealing weary brown eyes. Confusion. Shock. And then, recognition. "Who are you?" he rasped. Sanaa barely had the strength to respond before darkness claimed her. When Sanaa woke, she was no longer drifting in space. Instead, she lay in the small, cramped interior of a Terran shuttle, her limbs aching as if she had been torn apart and stitched back together. The rhythmic hum of an engine filled the air, and somewhere close, the unmistakable scent of antiseptic and burnt metal lingered. She turned her head and saw him. The human. He was alive, sitting on the floor beside her with a makeshift bandage around his arm. He had been injured after all, perhaps a wound she had not fully absorbed. He was watching her, concern furrowing his brow. "You're awake," he said. His voice was rough, like he had spent too much time breathing in smoke and ash. Sanaa pushed herself upright, ignoring the dizziness that followed. "Where are we?" "Emergency shuttle," he answered. "I got us out of there before the wreckage drifted too far into the Zilker patrol zone. Figured I owed you that much." Sanaa exhaled slowly. The cost of healing weighed on her like a physical shackle. Every life she saved took something from her, and she could feel the strain in her bones. She needed time to recover, but time was a luxury healers did not have. You saved me," the human continued, his voice quieter now. "I don't know how, but you did. And now you look like hell." She ignored his words. "You are stable," she said, her voice more detached than she intended. "That is all that matters." The human frowned. "That's not all that matters." He hesitated, then sighed. "Look, I don't know what you did to me, but I know enough about medicine to recognize when someone's burning themselves out. You're exhausted. And don't try to tell me you're fine, because you're not." Sanaa looked away. He was right, of course, but admitting it was another matter entirely. The Mirath had never prioritized their own well-being. Their philosophy had been simple: heal others, no matter the cost. She had lived by that creed all her life. The human studied her for a long moment, then extended a hand. "I'm Daniel, by the way. Captain Daniel Cross of the Terran Union Fleet." She did not take his hand. "Sanaa," she said simply. Daniel withdrew his hand with a shrug. "Well, Sanaa, we're going to need a plan. The ship's got limited supplies, and unless you've got some magic trick for fixing that, we're going to have to find a way to get to a safe zone." Sanaa closed her eyes. Her energy was too depleted to argue, and for the first time in a long while, She felt the faintest whisper of something foreign in her chest. Doubt. Had her people been wrong? Had she been wrong? As the shuttle drifted into the vast unknown, Sanaa could not shake the feeling that for the first time in her life, she was the one in need of saving. The shuttle's supplies were meager. A handful of emergency rations, a small cache of medical kits, and a distress beacon that, according to Daniel, was about as useful as a dead NAV computer in hostile space. Sanaa remained silent as Daniel rummaged through their inventory, muttering curses under his breath. She could feel his frustration, his anxiety, bleeding into the air like a palpable force. Humans were so easy to read. "So," Daniel said, slumping against the cold metal wall, "you got any bright ideas? Because I'm fresh out." Sanaa studied him. His body was healing well, better than she expected, but she could feel something else beneath his skin. A lingering energy, foreign yet familiar. She had left something behind when she healed him. Traces of herself, woven into his cells. She had never felt that before. "Your body is changing," she murmured. Daniel blinked. "What?" Sanaa reached out, her fingers brushing against his wrist. A pulse of recognition shot through her. His cells were adapting, integrating the remnants of her energy. "You are different now," she said. "I gave you more than I intended." Daniel tensed. "That doesn't sound good." "It is unknown," she admitted. He sighed. "Great. Just what I needed. First, I nearly die in a battle I shouldn't have been in. Then I get saved by an alien who almost kills herself in the process. And now you're telling me I might be, what? Mutating?" Sanaa did not answer. She did not know. But something told her this was only the beginning. Daniel's hand twitched beneath Sanaa's touch. He could feel a strange warmth lingering in his veins. Something foreign, something alive. It pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat, like an echo of her presence still tethered to him. He didn't know whether to be terrified or grateful. "You don't know what you did to me, do you?" he asked, his voice laced with cautious humor, though there was an underlying wariness in his gaze. Sanaa slowly withdrew her hand. "I did what was necessary." Daniel exhaled. "And what does that mean for me?" Sanaa hesitated. The truth was, she had never given so much of herself before. She had healed thousands, but only ever in fragments, taking their pain into herself, dissipating it into the void as her people had always done. But Daniel, something had been different. She should not have given him that much. She should not have left behind a part of herself. "Your body is adapting," she finally said. "I do not know how far it will go." Daniel ran a hand through his dark, disheveled hair. "That's not exactly reassuring." Sanaa didn't respond. She was too exhausted to continue this conversation. Her body ached, her vision swam with black spots, and the weight of yet another life saved pressed down on her chest like an anchor. For the first time in centuries, she had no strength left to heal. The shuttle drifted in the vast black, its engines silent, its occupants equally quiet. Daniel busied himself with the navigation console, though there wasn't much to be done. The fuel reserves were dangerously low, and they were floating somewhere deep in uncharted space. Sanaa remained still, her legs folded beneath her as she focused on her breathing. In, out, in, out. She could feel the strain in her bones, the warning signs of a healer's collapse. She had seen it happen before. She had watched others of her kind push themselves too far, giving and giving until there was nothing left to sustain them. She had watched them fade, their bodies withering like dying stars. The Mirath had called it the unraveling. A slow decay of body and mind, a final sacrifice in the name of their duty. And she was close to it now. Her people had never taught her how to stop it. They had never wanted to. "Sanaa?" She opened her eyes, finding Daniel crouched in front of her, studying her with the same intensity he had since she first saved him. "You're getting worse." It wasn't a question. Sanaa lowered her gaze. "It is the way of the Mirath." "That's bullshit," he shot back, sharper than she expected. "You're telling me your whole species just lets themselves die like this? No treatment, no way to recover." "We are healers," she said simply. "We do not take. We give." Daniel let out a frustrated laugh, shaking his head. "Yeah, well, that philosophy is getting you killed." Sanaa felt a flicker of something. Annoyance? Amusement? It had been so long since she had indulged in personal emotions, she barely recognized them anymore. "You do not understand," she murmured. Daniel exhaled through his nose. "No, I don't. But I know this." He pointed at her, voice firm. "You're not helping anyone if you're dead. So unless you want to be the last healer of your species and the last casualty, you need to figure out how to stop whatever's happening to you." Sanaa stared at him. Humans were such a strange species, so determined to fight the inevitable. But something in his words lingered. "You're not helping anyone if you're dead." Was that true? For centuries, she had believed that a healer's purpose was to serve, to mend others until there was nothing left of themselves. But if she faded now, if she allowed herself to unravel, what would remain? Nothing. And perhaps for the first time in her life, that thought truly unsettled her. Sanaa did not sleep. She rarely did. The Mirath had trained their bodies to function with minimal rest, relying on the flow of energy from the universe itself to sustain them. But now, as she sat in the dim light of the shuttle, she felt an emptiness where that energy should have been. She was dying. Slowly, but certainly. Daniel, of course, wasn't having any of it. "You need food," he declared, rummaging through the emergency rations. "Or nutrients. Or whatever the hell keeps you alive." Sanaa barely lifted her head. "It will not help." "Okay, well, humor me," he said, tossing a ration bar onto her lap. "You gave me a second chance, so I'm giving you one, whether you like it or not." She considered ignoring him, but she was too tired to argue. With a slow, deliberate motion, she unwrapped the ration bar and took a small bite. It was dry, flavorless, utterly lacking in any real sustenance. And yet, as it slid down her throat, something strange happened. The warmth inside Daniel, the energy she had left behind, stirred. She glanced at him, heart pounding. "What is it?" Daniel asked. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached out, grasping his wrist. The warmth flared beneath her touch, surging toward her like a tide returning to shore. Energy. Her energy. Still inside him. Still connected. She inhaled sharply. I do not understand." Daniel arched a brow. "Okay, now you're worrying me." Sanaa tightened her grip. "You are sustaining me." Daniel blinked. "Wait, what?" "The energy I left in you," she said slowly, piecing it together as she spoke. "It is still bound to me. And when I touch you, it—" She broke off, because the implications were impossible. This was not how Mirath healing worked. Energy, once given, was meant to be lost. It did not return. It did not replenish. But Daniel was different. He was human, and somehow, he was keeping her alive. They stared at each other in the dim light of the shuttle, realization settling between them like a fragile, dangerous thing. Daniel was the first to break the silence. "So, what does that mean?" Sanaa exhaled, the weight of understanding pressing against her ribs. "It means," she whispered, "that I may not have to die after all." For the first time in centuries, a spark of something long buried flickered in her chest. Hope. And it terrified her. Sanaa's fingers lingered on Daniel's wrist, the warmth of their connection pulsing between them like the flickering heartbeat of a dying star. This defied everything she had ever known about her kind, about healing, about the immutable laws that had governed her existence. Energy given was energy lost, until now. Daniel watched her carefully. He wasn't a man of philosophy or mysticism, but even he could tell something profound was happening. "So, let me get this straight," he said. "You're saying I've got some of your essence inside me?" Sanaa nodded slowly. "More than that. It is sustaining me." Daniel let out a dry laugh. "Great. That's not weird at all." She pulled her hand away, and the warmth between them dimmed. The fatigue immediately crept back into her limbs, an unwelcome but familiar presence. She had always lived with it, always carried the burden of healing others without replenishing herself. But for the first time, she had the chance to take something back. The thought unsettled her. Her people had spent centuries sacrificing themselves for the greater good. To draw energy from another, was unthinkable. But she was the last, and the last had no rules to follow. Daniel exhaled. Okay, let's assume this is real. It is, Sana interjected. Right, he amended. What do we do with that? She hesitated. I do not know. For all her knowledge, for all the lives she had saved, this was uncharted territory. Daniel rubbed his temples. All right, well, let's start with the basics. If I hold your hand, you feel better, right? Sana nodded once. Then maybe there's a way to, I don't know, share it without completely draining me? Sana studied him. His heartbeat was steady, his body was still intact. He didn't seem weaker after their brief contact. If anything, his presence felt stronger than before. That shouldn't be possible, but it was. Slowly, tentatively, she reached for him again. Her fingertips brushed his wrist, and the warmth surged back into her, rushing through her veins like a river thawing after centuries of ice. The exhaustion ebbed, the sharp ache in her bones dulled, and for the first time in what felt like eternity, she breathed without strain. Daniel inhaled sharply. Whoa. She withdrew again, watching him closely. Did it harm you? Daniel flexed his fingers, rolling his shoulders experimentally. Not that I can tell. I feel fine. Fine. That word meant everything. Sana had never taken without consequence. She had only ever given, until there was nothing left of herself. But here, now, with this human, she had found equilibrium. A way to survive. A way to heal. And it terrified her. They spent the next few hours testing their theory. Each time she touched him, the energy returned to her, strengthening her without weakening him. Daniel took it in stride, the way humans did, making half-hearted jokes about being a walking battery, while Sana struggled to process the implications. It makes no sense, she murmured, pacing the cramped shuttle interior. Mirath healing is irreversible. Energy does not regenerate. And yet, Daniel, sitting cross-legged on the floor, shrugged. Maybe your people just never figured this out? Sana stopped. That is impossible. The Mirath studied healing for millennia? Yeah. Daniel leaned back, folding his arms. And what happened to them? She stiffened. They had died. Every last one of them. Because they had given everything until there was nothing left. Daniel watched her reaction carefully. Look, I'm not saying your people weren't brilliant. But maybe, just maybe, they were wrong about this. Maybe they missed something. The word struck a chord she didn't want to acknowledge. The Mirath had always believed that sacrifice was the ultimate form of service. But what if it wasn't? What if healing was never meant to be a one-way exchange? What if she had been dying for no reason? Sana's hands clenched into fists. She had spent lifetimes believing she was fulfilling her purpose, that she was honoring the legacy of her kind. But what if she had only been repeating their mistakes? Daniel sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. I don't know what all this means, but I do know one thing. If you die, that's it. End of the Mirath. Game over. She turned away, staring at the cold metal walls of the shuttle, the last healer of her species. And if she continued down the same path as the rest of them, she would be the last to die as well. Something in her rebelled against that thought. For the first time, Sana wondered, did she want to live? Not just survive. Not just exist to serve others, but truly live. The thought was foreign, terrifying, and yet, she could not deny the small ember of longing that flickered to life inside her. She had lost her people. She had lost her home. But perhaps she had found something else. Perhaps she had found another way. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Then the ship's console beeped, breaking the spell. Daniel scrambled to his feet, checking the sensors. His brow furrowed. We've got a signal, he muttered. Sana moved beside him. A distress beacon? More like a patrol ship on a search pattern, he corrected. Terran Union. Could be friendly, could be trouble. Sana studied the readings. Can we evade them? Not without power, Daniel said grimly. Right now, we're just a floating hunk of metal. Sana considered their options. She was in no condition to heal him again if something went wrong. But at the same time, staying here wasn't an option either. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. Guess we're rolling the dice. He activated the comms. Union Patrol, this is Captain Daniel Cross, requesting assistance. We've got a disabled shuttle and limited resources. Over. There was a long pause. Then, a crackle of static. Captain Cross? A female voice, sharp with suspicion. You were listed as Kia in the last engagement. Identify yourself immediately. Daniel cursed under his breath. Yeah, about that, it's a long story. Sanaa watched him carefully. She could feel the tension radiating from him. Whoever was on the other end of that calm, they weren't entirely convinced. The voice returned, colder this time. Prepare for boarding. Any resistance will be met with force. Daniel turned to Sanaa. This could go bad. Real bad. She tilted her head. Are they your enemies? He exhaled. That depends on how much they trust a dead man coming back to life. Sanaa considered that. If the humans knew what she had done to him, if they realized what she was, would they see her as a miracle or as a threat? Either way, she had no strength left to fight. And so, as the Terran patrol ship loomed closer, Sanaa did the one thing she had never done before. She placed her trust in someone else, in Daniel, and she waited for the storm to come. The Union patrol ship loomed closer, its massive form blotting out the distant stars. Its hull was sleek and battle-worn, its markings unmistakably human. Sanaa could sense the people aboard. Soldiers, technicians, officers, moving like cogs in a well-oiled machine. Efficient, alert, suspicious. Daniel stood by the shuttle's viewport, watching the ships approach with a carefully neutral expression. But Sanaa could feel the storm inside him. You are afraid, she observed quietly. Daniel let out a short, humorless chuckle. Yeah, well, coming back from the dead tends to raise a few questions. Some people might take it the wrong way. Sanaa considered this. Your people fear what they do not understand. Pretty much, he admitted. He turned to her, his expression serious. Listen, when they board us, let me do the talking. The last thing we need is for them to start asking how I'm still breathing. You wish to conceal the truth, she said, tilting her head. I wish to keep us both alive, Daniel corrected. Sanaa hesitated. She had spent her existence offering truth through healing, laying bare the pain of others and taking it into herself. Deception was not the way of the Mirath. But the Mirath were gone, and if she wanted to live, she would have to adapt. She nodded once. Very well. The docking clamps engaged with a heavy thud, and moments later, the shuttle's hatch was overridden, the pressurized seal hissing as it was forced open. Then came the soldiers. A team of 6, weapons raised, armored in the sleek black plating of the Terran Union security forces. Their movements were precise, practiced, every step calculated for maximum control. The woman in front stepped forward, lowering her rifle slightly. Her face was hard, lined with experience, her gaze cold and assessing. Captain Daniel Cross, she said, her voice edged with disbelief. You're supposed to be dead. Daniel offered a wry smile. Yeah, I get that a lot. The woman didn't smile. Commander Elise Varan, she introduced herself. You fought under my command 3 years ago. Daniel's smile faded. Varan, damn, I thought you got spaced in the second wave? Yeah. Turns out, people have a way of surviving things they shouldn't. She studied him, then flicked her gaze toward Sanaa. Who's your friend? Sanaa remained silent, allowing Daniel to control the narrative. This is Sanaa, he said. She's the reason I'm still breathing. Varen's eyes narrowed. That's so? Daniel shrugged. Call it luck. Right place, right time. Varan didn't look convinced. HQ's gonna want answers. You're a walking classified case now, Cross, and your luck isn't gonna sit well with command unless we have some real explanations. She turned to her team. Secure the shuttle. We're taking them aboard. The soldiers moved in, 2 of them keeping their weapons trained while the others began scanning the shuttle for threats. Sanaa remained perfectly still, her pulse steady, her mind calm. But she could feel it. The barely restrained aggression in the air, the unspoken tension. These people were ready for a fight. And if they discovered what she had done to Daniel, there would be one. The interrogation chamber was cold, clinical. A single metal table, 2 chairs, dim lighting that flickered every few seconds. Sanaa had seen rooms like this before. She had watched men and women break inside them. She sat across from Daniel, her posture composed, her expression unreadable. He had insisted that they be questioned together, a small victory in a losing battle. The door hissed open, and Varan stepped inside. She placed a datapad on the table, staring at Daniel as if trying to see through him. "Let's start with the obvious," she said. "Your ship was destroyed. You were marked as Kia. Then, weeks later, you show up in a dead shuttle with an unidentified alien. You want to explain that?" Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Not much to explain. I survived." Varan's jaw tightened. "Survived how?" "Like I said, luck." Varan exhaled sharply, tapping her fingers against the datapad. "Command's not gonna accept luck as an answer, Cross. They're already scrambling over this. You had a death certificate. That doesn't get erased without some serious repercussions." Daniel's expression darkened. "And what exactly does Command plan to do with me?" Varan hesitated. "That depends on what you tell us." Silence stretched between them. Sanaa observed the interaction carefully. She could feel the weight behind Varan's words, the subtext of control, of power. This was not an interrogation. It was an assessment. Varan wanted to know whether Daniel was still an asset, whether he was still useful. Sanaa had seen this before, too. She leaned forward slightly, speaking for the first time. "You fear him." Varan's gaze snapped to her. "Excuse me?" "You fear what you do not understand," Sanaa said. "You do not know how he survived, and so you assume he is a threat." Varan scoffed. "Lady, we don't make assumptions. We assess risks." "And what risk does he pose?" Sanaa asked. Varan didn't answer immediately. Instead, she studied Sanaa, her eyes narrowing. "You're not just some lost traveler, are you?" she said slowly. "We ran scans. Your biology doesn't match anything in our records. No genetic links to any known species." Sanaa remained silent. "You healed him, didn't you?" Varan pressed. Daniel stiffened. "You don't know what you're talking about." Varan leaned forward. "Don't I? You were nearly dead when your ship went down. There's no way you could have survived that without help. And now, here you are, fully functional, no sign of your injuries. That's not luck. That's intervention." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You should be thanking her, not interrogating her." Varan ignored him, focusing entirely on Sanaa. "What are you?" Sanaa met her gaze, unflinching. "A healer." "Of what species?" Sanaa hesitated. She could feel the weight of the question, the implications it carried. The Mirath were gone. Naming them meant nothing now. She met Varan's eyes and simply said, "The last." Varan studied her for a long moment, then exhaled. "Well, that just makes things even more complicated." She stood. "You're both being detained for further evaluation. Until Command figures out what the hell to do with you, you're not going anywhere." Daniel clenched his fists. "Varan." "Not my call," she said, heading for the door. "But between you and me, if I were you, I'd be careful. HQ doesn't take kindly to unknown variables. And right now, that's all you are." The door hissed shut behind her, leaving them alone in the sterile room. Sanaa turned to Daniel. "You were correct," she said. "Your people do not trust miracles." Daniel exhaled, rubbing his face. "No, they don't." Sanaa sat back, closing her eyes. This was not the first time she had been treated as an anomaly, but it might be the most dangerous. And if the Terran Union decided she was too much of a risk, they would not hesitate to eliminate her. The detention cell was sterile, cold, and silent. Sanaa sat cross-legged on the metal cot, her hands resting lightly on her lap. She did not fidget, did not pace. Her kind had long since learned to endure confinement. Daniel, however, was not built for waiting. He stood by the reinforced glass wall, arms crossed, gaze fixed on the hallway beyond. His posture was deceptively relaxed, but Sanaa could feel the tension radiating from him like a slow-burning fire. "They're stalling," he muttered, "trying to decide what to do with us." Sanaa tilted her head. "You are their own. They will not harm you." Daniel let out a short, humorless laugh. "You'd be surprised. The Union doesn't like things it can't explain. And you? You're an anomaly wrapped in a damn miracle." Sanaa considered this. "And what do they see when they look at you?" Daniel turned to her. His brown eyes were shadowed with something she couldn't quite name. A problem, he said simply. She understood then. This was not just about her. The moment she had healed him, truly healed him, Daniel had stopped being one of them. To the Terran Union, he was now something else. You regret it, she observed. Daniel exhaled. No, I regret getting caught. Sanaa studied him. She could feel his frustration, his anger. But beneath it, something deeper. A question he hadn't dared voice. Are you afraid of what I have done to you? She asked. Daniel hesitated. Then, finally, I don't know. Sanaa nodded slowly. She understood. Fear of the unknown was the oldest of all fears. And Daniel Cross was no longer just a man. Hours passed. Then the door slid open, and Varan stepped inside. She was not alone. Behind her, a tall, sharp-eyed man entered, his uniform crisp, his presence heavy. His silver rank insignia gleamed under the sterile lights. Sanaa did not need to be human to recognize authority. This is Admiral Elias Rains, Varan said. He's here to determine what happens next. Rains regarded them both in silence. His gaze lingered on Daniel, then shifted to Sanaa with a calculating intensity. So, he said, voice smooth, but edged with steel. You're the alien who brought one of my captains back from the dead. Sanaa did not correct him. Rains clasped his hands behind his back. We ran a full medical scan on Captain Cross. His vitals are stable, stronger than expected. No residual injuries. No genetic anomalies that we could detect. His gaze darkened. But something is different. Sanaa remained silent. Rains turned to Daniel. What do you remember? Before the shuttle? Before you were saved? Daniel met his gaze without flinching. I remember dying, he said simply. Varan shifted slightly, but Rains remained impassive. And after? Daniel exhaled. Pain. And then her. He glanced at Sanaa. She healed me. Rains studied Sanaa once more. How? Sanaa met his gaze evenly. I am Mirath. Rains frowned. That means nothing to me. It would not, she said. We are gone. Rains narrowed his eyes. Your species is extinct? Sanaa inclined her head. And yet, you remain, he mused. He leaned forward slightly. What exactly are you, Sanaa? I am a healer, she said simply. Rains exhaled, shaking his head. I don't think you understand the situation you're in. The Union does not take kindly to unknown forces meddling with its soldiers. Sanaa remained composed. And what do you intend to do about it? Rains studied her. That depends. He turned back to Daniel. You said she healed you, but we have no way of knowing what else she did to you. You could be compromised, infected, changed in ways we don't yet understand. Daniel's jaw tightened. I feel fine. Rains arched a brow. And that's supposed to be reassuring? He stepped closer. You were dead, Captain. Not just wounded. Not just on the brink. Dead. And now you're standing here, healthy as ever. Daniel didn't waver. So what's your plan? Lock me up? Cut me open? Run experiments? Rains didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at Sanaa. We will understand what she did to you, he said. One way or another. Sanaa held his gaze. I will not be dissected. Rains smiled coldly. That's up to you. She felt it then. The subtle shift in his posture. The quiet threat beneath his words. They would not kill her outright. Not yet. But they would test her. And if she did not cooperate, they would use Daniel against her. She had seen men like Rains before. She had healed men like Rains before. They did not believe in miracles. Only control. They were separated. Daniel was escorted to a secured medical bay, where he would be monitored, scanned, studied. Sanaa was led to another room, larger than the interrogation chamber, but just as cold. A dozen figures in lab coats stood waiting, data pads in hand, eyes sharp with curiosity and suspicion. A testing chamber. She was not surprised. At the far end of the room, a large containment pod was lowered from the ceiling. Inside, a man lay unconscious, his body riddled with deep plasma burns. His vitals were weak, his breath shallow. Sanaa understood immediately. A test. Rain's voice crackled through the overhead comms. He was critically injured in battle. The medics gave him a 5% survival chance. We want to see what your odds are. Sana approached the pod. The man inside was dying. Not yet gone, but close. She placed her hand against the glass. The energy inside her stirred. She could save him. She would save him. But this was not just a test of her abilities. It was a test of control. If she succeeded, the Union would want her. If she refused, they would not hesitate to find her limits the hard way. Sana closed her eyes. She was Mirath. She was the last. And now, for the first time, she was faced with a choice her people had never allowed themselves to consider. Was healing a gift? Or was it a curse? The man inside the pod let out a weak, pained breath. Sana's fingers curled against the glass. She could not let him die. She would not. Taking a slow breath, she placed her palm against the pod and let the energy flow. The room fell silent, and the balance of power began to shift. The energy surged from her fingertips, seeping through the glass like mist in the dawn. It wound its way through the containment pod, sinking into the broken man's body, threading through ruined flesh and shattered bone. Sana felt everything. His pain, raw and burning. The jagged edges of torn tissue. The desperate fight of his cells clinging to existence. She could fix it. She always could. But she had never been watched like this before. She felt the weight of their stares. Doctors, scientists, soldiers, standing in silence, waiting for the impossible to unfold. To them, she was not a healer. She was an experiment, a specimen, a resource to be harnessed. And yet, she could not stop. Healing was instinct. It was breathing. The man's pulse steadied. His burned flesh mended itself, the charred tissue shedding like dying embers, replaced by fresh, unscarred skin. His breath deepened. His fingers twitched. Then, with a sharp inhale, he opened his eyes. Gasps rippled through the room. Instruments beeped frantically. The scientists whispered among themselves, their voices quick and clipped, words tumbling over one another in a scramble to record what they had witnessed. On the overhead comms, Rain's voice was calm, but heavy with something dark. Remarkable. Sana did not reply. She was still reeling. Because something was wrong. She was drained. More than usual. More than ever before. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pulled her hand away from the pod. Her vision swam. The walls of the room seemed farther away, the lights dimmer. She clenched her jaw. No, not now. She forced herself to straighten, to mask her exhaustion, but Rains had already seen it. Fascinating, he murmured over the comms. It takes something from you, doesn't it? The more you heal, the weaker you become. Sana said nothing. Rains exhaled slowly, which means you have limits. And that was what he had truly been testing. Not her ability to heal, but how far she could go before breaking. The reinforced doors hissed open, and 2 guards stepped inside. Their weapons were holstered, but their presence was not a request. You need rest, Rains said, his voice carefully neutral. We'll resume testing soon. Testing, not questioning, not negotiations. Testing, like an experiment. Sana glanced at the man she had saved. His chest rose and fell with steady ease. A life returned, a future restored. At the cost of herself, the Mirath had believed this was their purpose, that giving everything, until there was nothing left, was the ultimate form of service. But now, as she was led from the room, she felt a cold certainty settle in her chest. They would keep taking from her, until she had nothing left to give. The cell was the same, cold, sterile, silent. Daniel was already there when she arrived. He stood as soon as the door opened, his eyes scanning her face, searching. You look like hell, he muttered. Sana sat carefully on the cot. I am intact. Daniel wasn't convinced. What did they do to you? She exhaled. They tested me. Daniel's jaw tightened. And she hesitated. I healed a dying man. A pause. Then, and what did it cost you? She looked away. Too much. Daniel swore under his breath. He began pacing, running a hand through his hair. This is bad, he muttered. They're gonna push you until you break. They'll keep taking until... He stopped himself. Sana finished the thought for him. Until there is nothing left. Daniel turned to her, his expression dark. We have to get out of here. Sanaa tilted her head. You believe that is possible? Daniel let out a dry laugh. Everything's possible. Just depends on how much you're willing to risk. She studied him carefully. There was something fierce in his eyes now, an edge of determination she had not seen before. Do you have a plan? She asked. Not yet, he admitted. But we don't have time to wait. Rains isn't gonna let this go. He's got his hands on something he doesn't understand, and people like him, they don't stop until they own it. Own it. Own her. Sanaa inhaled slowly. The Mirath had never fought back. They had never resisted when the galaxy took from them. And where had that left them? Extinct. She turned to Daniel. If we escape, what will you do? Daniel hesitated. What do you mean? If you are no longer Union, she said, then what are you? He didn't answer immediately. Finally, he exhaled. I guess we're both trying to figure that out. Sanaa nodded slowly. For the first time, she had a choice. To heal, to serve, to give herself away until she was nothing, or to live, to fight for herself. She closed her eyes, feeling the last traces of Daniel's energy still lingering inside her. Yes, she would live. And the first step was escaping this cage. Their chance came sooner than expected. A guard arrived hours later with a meal tray, moving through the automated security field with the mindless routine of a man who had done this 100 times before. He wasn't expecting Daniel. The moment the guard stepped inside, Daniel moved. Fast, precise, lethal. He drove his elbow into the man's throat, silencing him instantly. Then, with a swift, practiced motion, he yanked the guard's sidearm free and caught him before he hit the ground. Sanaa watched, impressed despite herself. Daniel wasn't just a soldier. He was a survivor. He turned to her, his breath steady, eyes sharp. Can you walk? Yes, she said. He handed her the guard's ID chip. Then let's get the hell out of here. Sanaa took the chip, feeling the weight of this moment settle deep in her bones. She had spent centuries walking into prisons like this, healing the broken, mending the dying, and then leaving with nothing but emptiness inside her. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't here to save someone else. This time, she was here to save herself. Daniel checked the hallway, then motioned for her to follow. Sanaa stepped forward, her pulse steady, her mind clear. For the first time in her existence, she was not a healer. She was free, and she intended to keep it that way. They moved quickly through the hallways, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the endless expanse of steel and silence. Daniel led the way, his eyes scanning each corner, alert for any guards or security systems. Sanaa followed closely behind, her body still weak, but her mind sharp, focused. Every step felt like a victory. She had spent so long as the last of her kind, the weight of that responsibility pressing down on her with every life she saved, every soul she healed. But in this moment, with each step away from the holding cell, she was free. Not just from the Union's grasp, but from the shackles she had placed on herself, the ones forged by centuries of service. How much farther? She asked, her voice steady, though a flicker of weariness crept through. Daniel glanced over his shoulder. Not much. The exit's just ahead. Sanaa nodded. She could feel the energy in her body, the remnants of what she had given and taken. It was different now, not just restoring her, but empowering her. The connection between her and Daniel, the strange bond they shared, had changed the very fabric of her existence. They reached the exit door. No guards in sight, just the faint hum of the station's power running through the walls. Daniel pulled out the ID chip and slid it into the reader. The door opened with a soft hiss, revealing the darkened space beyond. The scent of cold metal and recycled air filled their lungs. They were close. Daniel motioned for her to follow him as he stepped into the docking bay. It was empty, just a few abandoned shuttles lined up along the walls. Their escape was nearly within reach. But as they moved deeper into the bay, a sharp voice rang out. "Hold it right there." Sanaa froze, her body tensing, her senses snapping into focus. Commander Varan stood at the far end of the bay, flanked by 2 armed soldiers. Her face was grim, her hand resting on the holstered weapon at her side. "You won't make it out," Varan said coldly. We've got this entire station on lockdown. Surrender now, and we'll reconsider your fate. Daniel turned to Sanaa, his hand hovering near his sidearm. He was ready to fight, to escape. But Sanaa felt something stir inside her, something that told her this wasn't the fight they had to win. Not anymore. Varan stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. Do you think you're the first alien to try and escape our custody? She smirked, her gaze flicking to Sanaa. You're just one more specimen in a long line of disappointments. Sanaa took a slow breath. She could feel it, the shift in the air, the tension of the moment. This was it, the final test. Do you believe your people are the only ones capable of surviving? She asked quietly, her voice ringing with a strange calm. Varan faltered for a split second, her expression flickering between disbelief and something else. What are you talking about? Sanaa took a step forward, drawing from the energy within her. You think you control the universe. But there is more to it than your armies, your machines. There is power beyond your reach. And I will not be your prisoner anymore. With a flick of her wrist, she reached out to Daniel, pulling the energy they had shared together. The warmth, the strength, into a focused surge. It radiated outward in a pulse, invisible but potent, flowing from her body to his and then outward, expanding into the room. Varan and the soldiers took a step back, their eyes wide with shock as the energy crackled in the air. The power inside Sanaa and Daniel was no longer just a bond. It was a force, something new and untapped. Sanaa's eyes met Varan's, and for a moment, she saw a flicker of hesitation in the commander's gaze. It was fleeting, but it was enough. Enough to give them the chance they needed. Leave, Sanaa commanded, her voice sharp and clear. Before you regret it. Varan said nothing, but she turned on her heel and signaled for the soldiers to follow. Slowly, they retreated, leaving the bay empty once more. Daniel exhaled a slow breath. That was unexpected. Sanaa didn't answer. She felt the weight of the moment settle over her. She had made her choice. Let's go, she said quietly, turning toward the nearest shuttle. The shuttle hummed to life as they climbed aboard, the familiar, reassuring sounds of the engines filling the air. Daniel took the controls, his hands steady, despite the tension still running through his veins. Sanaa stood beside him, watching the station fade into the distance, the cold void of space opening up before them. They were free, but for how long? Sanaa didn't know. As the stars stretched out before them, she realized that she no longer cared about the future, the dangers they would face. What mattered was that she had finally taken control of her own life. She turned to Daniel, her eyes meeting his. Thank you, she said softly. Daniel looked at her, his gaze steady and unwavering. We both got something out of this, huh? Sanaa nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Yes, we did. And for the first time in a long while, she felt something that was not just the weight of survival. She felt the stirrings of something more, something human, something real. Perhaps healing wasn't just about mending broken bodies. Perhaps it was about mending broken hearts. Where do we go now? Daniel asked, his voice calm but with a hint of uncertainty. Sanaa looked out at the endless stars. Anywhere, she said, her voice firm with newfound resolve. Anywhere but here. And as the shuttle drifted toward the vast unknown, the last healer of the Mirath realized she was no longer alone. For the first time, she was free.